Hi there, welcome all. Hope you can hear me okay. Just wanted to give you a quick nod that we will be starting in just a few minutes. We're just waiting for some of the attendees just to fully come in. We've got a good few of you on at the moment, but just a few minutes and then we will be getting started. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we've given time there. We've got a good number of attendees on the call as well. Steve, just a quick sound check just to make sure you're online and okay as well. As I appreciate you just literally dropped off. Sorry, we were literally doing a sound check for 10 minutes and I just noticed Steve had dropped off just where we started. Always good, but you're online, so that's good.
I am.
So welcome and hi there all as well. So thank you for joining us today. This is a session that we've run a number of series on across a few different topics, and we're continuing to do so. And really today's session, we're going to be looking at kind of remote desktop options, or more specifically, looking at really a kind of a technical Q&A and a bit of an overview around Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop that we've seen certainly a lot more activity, as probably everyone can maybe imagine in more recent times. And certainly, it's looking like a strong, promising solution for further ongoing use for customers as well. So this is not intended in any way as any kind of sales activity or otherwise. This is really genuinely intended to be very much an open Q&A type panel discussion. So we do want you to feel comfortable, to ask your questions, and we've got a number of kind of questions that's come in pre-hand. So thank you for those that have sent those in, and do welcome anyone on the call as well to put forward questions you may have during the session, and we'll certainly either look to maybe address them there, or most likely we will keep the questions just for the end of the kind of session, where we'll really then have that just open forum Q&A panel as well. Today you're joined by myself, Phil Mercer, and also Steve Beaumont. So just quick rounds of introductions, I think, from ourselves. So I'm basically the managing director at PowerOn, but essentially I do quite a few roles, and I do like to keep my hands in. So I often act as what we refer to as a business consultant. So in that context, I usually have my strapline of saying I'm technical but not the techie, but essentially help bring a lot of the technology and kind of commercial and business elements of conversations together to really help customers define a path forwards for them as well. And then my colleague Steve, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yep, and if you use the tagline of techie but not the techie, I'm most definitely the geek of the bunch. So everything that is systems management related has been my world for many years now. I'm not going to start revealing my exact age on that side, but certainly being able to understand where both the technical solutions and the business needs gel together to be able to deliver solutions is what really drives me on that side.
Great. And if you'd like to then just go to quickly the agenda, Steve, and then we'll get really actually into the actual good stuff. So just quickly, simple agenda for us today. What we're really going to do is start from a session perspective of just giving you a bit of insight into Windows Virtual Desktop, just giving a loose assumption, that we've got a range of experiences on the call today. So we'll just give you a few little simple introductions and considerations, show you it, and show you a little bit of actually how that performance really works in the real kind of world. And then really just starting to kind of talk around some of those considerations and security aspects. And then effectively, once we've kind of gone through a bit of that overview, which we're intending on only being kind of say 20 to 30 minutes maximum, depending on questions or the bits that may slow us down during it, then we'll really, as I say, get into that open kind of Q&A session as well. So without further ado, I will essentially pass over to Steve to get us started.
Helps if I'm not on mute. Awesome, thank you, Phil. So, morning, everybody. Just want to open up this sort of conversation around, before we start diving properly into what Windows Virtual Desktop is, or WVD as I'll probably call it for the rest of the session, just to save time and my voice. That idea of being able to deliver a remote access solution is probably absolutely firmly set in people's minds at the minute with everything that's going on. Now, trying to drive away past that initial conversation of the reasons why it's become such a focus, but starting to consider what that long-term plan for remote access to people is where we're now starting to see that conversation and the delivery mechanisms of doing that. And there are many different ways to do that. And that's why I just wanted to kind of stick on this point for a second, just to understand that that traditional approach that most people will have around VPN, there are pros and cons around all the different ways of doing this. And VPN is absolutely a already established methodology for many people, and it is a known entity. And it's the same for a lot of these different solutions. This isn't anything radically new. How and the benefits it delivers from a solution is probably the main interesting bit. But one of the main key weaknesses that we see for a lot of the existing solutions is that they were designed for a scenario where it was either a known fixed quantity of users that have to work from home, or for very niche purposes such as IT's remote backdoor into the solution, into the environment, or for certain VIPs, etc. Which means that scalability might not have always been embedded from the start on some of these legacy solutions. Now, VPN, absolutely. Main thing is, though, it was also targeted at corporate-owned devices. So there's that idea that you cannot just say you're fine, go home and work on your iPad. It's not necessarily going to have that connection back in via VPN. That was generally driven by your laptops that you issue to users that not every single user would have had. Similarly with RDS, that was probably the biggest one that was limited by scale because it's number of session hosts and stuff that you have behind it. Again, licensing, if it is something like Citrix that's needed for it, or RDS CALs, and whether that was actually published externally. And then there is that solution of, well, actually, certain times, like we have at present, unprecedented means that we just make it a free-for-all, which after that is an option. Whether it's actually probably the best option, especially when you consider all the loss of control that you'll have, potential data breaches with leaks of data that's taken down to people's personal devices that you just don't know exactly what is on that endpoint, are probably the biggest things that would limit that, but it's doable in a push, I suppose. But if we start to look at how we can combine some of the benefits of all of these different things, being able to bring in a mixture of the bring your own device scenario, personal devices, different range of devices, so considering tablets, etc., that's where we start to talk around what might be potentially possible with the WVD style solution. So I just wanted to highlight that, yes, there are times and places for the different bits. VPNs might be more applicable in one scenario, WVD fills a gap in another scenario, but trying to avoid some of the unloosening of security controls, the loosening of security controls, so we still do it in a managed fashion. It's probably the biggest thing for me in this side. Helps in my slides transition. The other flip side is, and I briefly touched on it a moment ago when I started, is rather than just thinking about it as that reactionary knee-jerk, right, we need to go buy capacity, so we'll just go buy some extra servers, we'll fling some extra VPN licenses in and be done with it, and then waste it later on. But also from a general optimization aspect of only taking that concept of paying for what you need, one of the things that we'll just touch on briefly as we go through is how the WVD side has been specifically crafted to allow you to address exactly what your demand for the solution is, and doing that pay on demand approach of being able to scale up or down very easily. So you're not either overpaying to give you the spare capacity if you need it, or underpaying and then finding you can't meet the actual peaks of activity over time as it's needed. And that is mainly one of the biggest factors of moving from either something like RDS on-premise or a VPN fixed solution to a cloud-based SaaS delivery of a remote working solution. So it's probably a good time to just pause and do a quick demo and just show you literally what the actual WVD solution looks like from an initial base perspective, give you an idea of what we are then talking about as we go through it. So if I just come out of my PowerPoint. So I'm actually working on my own personal PC today. So you can see I've got a lovely non-corporate background, but this thing that I am waving around on screen is my remote desktop access for my corporate applications. So unfortunately, I haven't removed the physical install of Word and Excel and stuff off my PC, mainly because I dropped it on a minute ago for some other tasks. However, you can quite easily at this point say, well, fine, we can use things like conditional access, some of the other Microsoft solutions to restrict where we can access data from, which means we can only access corporate data from what we class as published applications. Now, there's two ways to get into these applications, either using the remote desktop built-in application. If you're using this one that's downloadable and installable, you'll find it also integrates directly into your start menu. So you can see here, I have my Power On apps just natively there. So if I was starting to look for it and say I needed to do some work in Sage, you can see it's there and it's available on my start menu. There is also the option to run this actually as a HTML5 browser app. So if I go to my remote desktop link, you can see it can take me through. Now, because I've already signed in just before while I was doing demo prep, it's likely just to sign me back in again. Yep, so it's already recognized I'm in there. But because this is linked into your Azure Active Directory user credentials, it will also utilize any of the things that you have set up on that, such as conditional access to ensure that you're on a half-decent machine if you need to restrict it down more, or make sure that you enforce things like multi-factor authentication, geo-awareness, so you can't open it from certain countries, etc. You have control over exactly where users are opening this. However, there's a big benefit of being able to do this within the browser, and that's because it's pure HTML. So we don't worry about what device we're accessing it from. You want to have staff sat on a couch using an iPad in front of the TV? Fine, they can use an iPad. You want to have them accessing it from an Android tablet? Fine, they can use an Android. Mac, you could use this. However, Mac does have a full native client. So there's pros and cons of both, which I'll show you in a second. But let me just open something to show you the experience. So if I go and open, actually Sage is probably a bad example. Let me open System Center. Now I have the access because being demos, I allow things, don't allow things. I maybe don't want to allow printers, so I can untick that, or you can do that from a policy layer. But when this starts to connect, it will then render basically your corporate application natively within the browser. Just just opening up. Now, the good thing is as well, because this is obviously hosted, here we go, let me log on. Because it's obviously hosted up in the cloud, the sessions, depending on your timing settings, can stay active in the background between the user's device actually being active. So if they turn the device off and go and use a different device or swap and hop from different devices, that session will generally follow them. So you'll see in a minute, I'll be able to move from within the web browser if I was deciding that it was a nice day and go and sit out in the garden doing some work, then come back into my main PC. I can retake control of that session back on my desktop using this remote desktop app side and be able to flick seamlessly between the two. Now, the demo gods are obviously loving me at the minute because this is the first time I've rerun this connection to this app for a while. Now, while waiting for that just to spawn, the other option I do have is maybe we don't want to publish out individual applications. Maybe we want to give a much more corporate environment look and feel, and we can provide a full corporate desktop. So before I jump into that, let's just see this application. So here we go. That traditional Windows 32 style, so this is Microsoft System Center 2019 orchestrator that I'm running, and I have it now rendering in a web browser. I can do all the wonderful things like drag and drop. I can just basically use my corporate application. Now, this is that typical sort of client server app. So this is busy running up in Azure on the VMs that are running the WWbd, and it accesses SQL databases, can interact with on-premise infrastructure, just exactly the same way as we do normally. Now, as I said a minute ago, that's great. It's in the browser, I can resize it, all the rest of it is pretty dynamic. But I can also go and grab that session. If I just simply double click that, it should basically disconnect me from my web browser session and bring that more back locally onto my PC. There we go, so you can see that's disconnected. So I can close my browser now and it'll open up back on my main desktop. There we go, and you can see it's pretty much a seamless application. I can have that running alongside other local-based applications, but the two don't interact. Now, I mentioned that full desktop slide, so I already have it open down at the bottom, and you can see I now have that full experience. Now, I'll come back to this bit in a little while and do a bit more of a demo around exactly what I've got open around on here. So, going back to the slide decks. In essence, you saw that I had there a couple of different access methods. That's because there's three main pieces within what makes up the WWbd environment. Now, we quite rightly have clients. They could be ones that you fully corporately manage, so your desktops and your laptops that you normally manage through normal terms. They might be connected to your domain fully, or if it's more of a modern centric, attached to Azure Active Directory and managed through something like Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Or it could be that personal device, either with an in-place bring your own device policy and layered on a bit of control via the likes of Intune for that whole sort of MAM approach. Or it could be a completely unmanaged device where we need to make sure that we're not dropping any sort of corporate data at all. We completely don't trust that device and how we deliver to it and the style of device that's been through. So we have a mixture of different things, Windows, Android, Mac, and so on that you can deliver this down to. Plus we have the fully more integrated clients in terms of the Mac and the Windows clients that can actually deliver it integrated into the actual OS. So that's the one side. You've briefly seen a bit of an example experience of how I can deliver either just applications or full desktop that we'll explore a bit more on a device as such. Now, this middle piece is probably the most important change when it comes to the WWbd side. And that's the fact that if you have experience in managing Citrix or RDS environments, and even some respects the VMware Horizon style things, there is a management layer that you have to manage on premise for them. to be able to actually make sure that things are running well, how you present it out externally, how you load balance it, and so on. Now, WVD takes that pain of that management of that on-premises infrastructure away by being a Microsoft managed service. So you saw earlier when I had to sign into the web interface, etc., all that authentication, the connection, the load balancing is all managed by Microsoft as part of the host pool access that you spin up in Azure. You do, however, on the right-hand side, still have some stuff to manage in terms of the actual desktops that you're delivering and the applications. So you're spinning up the actual compute resource side and the OS that you deliver and the applications that go onto it, and you're still leveraging your current investments within Active Directory. So your same user authentication, the same groups and stuff that are there. And then we can add in some other bits and pieces for you to manage around how you deliver that user profile state, how we make sure that users can swap between the different environments that you have and take settings, etc., with them. And that's using some of the acquisitions Microsoft made with the FXlogix and where you store that data. So you're more focused, though, not on actually managing the tin, and especially on that right-hand side, you're still not too worried about what the actual tin's doing in terms of providing you with the storage and the compute. You are absolutely focused on the look and the feel and the configuration and the delivery of what is done within that environment than how it's actually delivered. Now, building on top of that, because this at the end of the day starts to bring it back into that very well-known end user experience desktop management arena again. So we all know how to deploy apps to it, hopefully, using things like Configuration Manager or, heaven forbid, manual installs. There's some new stuff coming up that we'll talk around later around MSI attach and stuff, but its base layer is the same things that we've done for ages in terms of managing desktops. But you can layer on top of that. So using some of the stuff that Microsoft have spent lots of time and money and effort delivering in terms of the security controls, how we actually think about how we provide this out to users, etc., means that we can bring in a solution that we're very familiar with, but we can enhance with a lot of security controls and stuff that we might not necessarily have had for doing this on premises. So a lot of the security side, being able to configure things like conditional access that defines where in the world we can access it, what type of device we can access it from, what our risk acceptance is for devices and their health, etc., to be able to access them services, we can natively have and available for controlling how we access it. Things like multi-factor authentication, it's more or less a tick box exercise within here to say, yes, I want that. There's no spinning up lots of on-premises servers, being able to set it up, being able to create them stages, use RSA tokens, physical hardware. No, we can just say, fine, we want to be able to enable it and either have text messaging or authenticator app control over it. The fact that we're reducing attack surfaces to the actual solution, because again, we're not drilling in through from the internet into our internal on-premises environment, being able to open up specific ports that can be abused. This uses, and Microsoft being quite clever on this, on using reverse connection technology. So the session hosts are looking for that incoming connection to Microsoft's front door. And basically when it checks in and sees that there is one there, it will establish a secure SSL channel out from the environment to the client and use that for bringing that information backwards and forwards for displaying the sessions and so on. Now, again, it's like anything, you're going to want to control how you administer this. So that's all covered with us with multiple different ways that we can slice and dice the administrative controls. So you can say, well, actually, fine, we've got storage teams that look after the Azure infrastructure storage. We've got the actual server teams that make sure that they control how they spin up the VMs, control the scaling, etc. And then the desktop teams have the rights to be able to push apps and so on. So you can still keep this within the bounds of the teams that you need to, without just saying, here you go, you're now suddenly a WVD admin and have control of everything that others need to learn, everything that others may already know. Now, the one bit that I've not touched on a minute ago when I was showing the demo side was the fact that, yes, I was running some apps and you're showing me go to a full desktop side, What I didn't say was that is also a Windows 10 environment. Now, we had this concept of on-premises before with things like RDS and Citrix, where we were using a server operating system and doing multiple sessions on the same box, so having 10, 15, 20, 100, whatever users connected to a single server OS. Now, we've always had that concept of being able to RDP 1-2 users onto a Windows 10 box to be able to do admin tasks. What we're seeing Microsoft do here is they've delivered Windows 10 multi-session, so we can have many, many more users depending on your performance and the size of your compute connected to the single OS session, so a single VM supporting multiple users that we used to have when we was using a server OS. So two benefits of that. One, we're back down to the desktop OS. So this is the one that we know that desktop apps work, etc. on, because that is what we're used to deploying to, not a server OS. And we're getting that economies of scale because we can fit more users on a single VM than having to spend money on one VM per user. Side note, that is available, that is an option, there are use cases scenarios for it. However, the majority of the time you want to be thinking about how to pack density into these solutions, and using multi-session environments is one of the best ways. But this is designed not to allow that bleeding through. So when we talk about isolated user sessions, it's not as if users are aware that there's another user on it. It's not as if you're going to get movement of the same mouse cursor or random files appearing on people's desktops. They are completely isolated and secure, and you can have different teams working on the same box. So you can have finance and HR on the same box, and it's not going to conflict and allow that bleeding of information across the environment. So, as I mentioned, there's all this idea of using some of the built-in security and leveraging what you may have already got within your license investment. Like anything, there's a base level of control that's going to come through when starting to use WWbd, and some of them stuff that are needed to support it brings in things like conditional access and multi-factor authentication that I've mentioned. There are some native investments in the security that I've mentioned around reverse connector stuff that just come through with the Windows Virtual Desktop, and being able to utilize that Azure Active Directory authentication, again, not having to come back to on-premise and look at things like ADFS and so on. But the more that you have already invested within the licensing stack, the more that can also come into play. If you have SKUs that bring in things like the Defender ATP, the Azure ATP, your user and your security posture awareness comes into play again within this. So it will integrate with that and give you that better view of what's going on, bringing in things like potentially Azure Sentinel within your Azure environment, so you can trace what's going on, how it's being utilized, where it's being utilized from. These all build on together very seamlessly and very quickly. This is that idea that this is not just a drop it third-party bespoke in a corner and there you go, we just leave it alone. This natively integrates with a lot of the stuff that you're potentially already doing or can do, or is a roadmap into looking at other avenues as you start to build on the Microsoft stack in its entirety. It natively just sits there at the heart. So back to the demo, because it's always good to actually see what a lot of the bits and pieces that I'm talking around. So you saw me earlier, I was connecting to bits and pieces. Now, unfortunately, because I've already been doing some of the prep and stuff for this, you didn't see potentially some of the MFA and bits and pieces kicking in. I'll see if I can try and force it in a second. However, I teased a second ago just around this full desktop experience. Now, I'm very quickly just going to put myself onto DND. You can see I have Teams working here, which is always a hot topic at the minute because everyone is having to work remotely, still want to allow collaboration. And I'll dive into this in a second and just show you in a bit more. But you can see that I was utilizing things like Word, what to be expected. We all have to do documentation and stuff all the time. But if I just minimize everything, you can see that I am working on a much more of a corporate environment now. I have my background controls, I can utilize group policy. This is a full desktop experience, the same way as you would manage and use a Windows 10 device on a physical piece of hardware. You can see that I am running on Windows 10. So this is not an server OS. This is natively Windows 10 running from Azure. And actually, as much as I don't like error messages, this is probably a good time to show that if I do now try to sign back into OneDrive, it's going to start to ask me, fingers crossed, for MFA. There we go. Here comes my MFA sign in. And my watch decides not to prompt me. My phone did. There we go. And it signs in. So MFA is running in the background. It knows this isn't my usual device. It's prompting me, just making sure that the security controls are there. Now this is using OneDrive, and you can see that I've got some little crosses and bits and pieces on some of my files because it is actively using that whole known folder move and redirecting things like my documents folder, my pictures folder. I think pictures is probably safe to go in the documents. Yeah. So these are not stored just on this cloud desktop. These are stored in OneDrive, so they natively follow me around the place. Now, like anything, performance is always going to be the thing for most people that they want to be aware of and how it works. I'm actually got in the background running a nice little YouTube video, so nice 4 hours of ambient study music. You can see it's fairly smooth, it's running away in the background, it's not putting too much stress on the device. But more interestingly is when I have finished doing my Word documents, if I go and look at what I've got on my file server, etc., so connecting to that traditional style infrastructure. So if you have a Windows Server file server, you can still get to it. But if I want to do some collaboration, I want to be able to make sure that I can still use the things I use like Teams. So if I go and change to my chat and go for, where is it, my wwbd call. So I know, Phil, you're on this call, but let me send you a message and let me just call you if that's okay.
Of course, yeah.
Unfortunately, it does look like I have lost the ability to use my video camera. Just mute that. So normally I would have the ability to actually be able to use my video camera. I think it might be because I've connected to the Citrix session for this webinar. However, that video camera was there earlier and I was going to do a lovely demo on it and be able to show you actually doing nice smooth audio and video through it. However, the demo gods don't seem to be favoring me at the moment. I might try quitting out of that and re-signing back in a little while. But you get your normal bits and pieces that you expect to be in here. You saw earlier I had certain applications like Sage and stuff, so it doesn't have to be just Microsoft-based applications. I've got that whole orchestrator one. Yes, I appreciate that is a Microsoft application, but it's not just designed for just purely Word and Excel and so on. So the Office suite, this is what you currently use and deploy to your existing machines available here and now, whether they are connecting to on-premise resources or whether you've moved some stuff across up into Azure. So I'm just going to pause for 2 seconds. Is there any initial questions while I am in the demo environment before I move on and get to some of the other bits?
So we did have a question. It was essentially when you were just showing the orchestrator app as you are doing now, whether that is connecting to a physical backend PC or connecting to an RDP farm of servers.
So this application at the minute, so in my full desktop, the application itself is installed on this full desktop, but it is connecting. I don't know if I can show from here. It is, no, I can't. It is connecting to this big file server. So this is another separate VM elsewhere that is running SQL Server and so on. So it is a client server based application. Client interface lives on this VM. Backend that stores all the data and the SQL database is off on another VM that's appropriately scaled and all the rest of it. The one that you saw me having down here, so this is running from a pool of VMs. So they are my session hosts. So the same way that that full desktop is a single session host with multiple users on it. This one that is just running as a remote app is running from some other session hosts. So it can be running on 1, 2, 3, 5, but again, is connecting back to that same backend server. Is just the application itself that is running on the actual WVD session hosts. I hope that makes sense. Cool. If that was the only one for now, we will carry on through.
It is. We do have some more, but yeah, we can carry on through, I think.
So this might answer some of them, and if not, we'll answer them as we get on to the question side. But that's basically giving you a little bit of a flavor, I hope, of in terms of what it is that we're talking around in terms of WVD being that ability to host an application and either publish it as an application or publish a full corporate environment desktop down to any sort of device. But what's probably more interesting is also that's where we are at the minute, but what's coming down the pipeline. Now, as I mentioned, lots of current capabilities, so we have a lot of this lot in play. You've just seen me using things like the Teams support stuff. There is optimizations still incoming. Microsoft constantly improving this to make it even more efficient, so you don't have to invest heavily in that whole compute and the memory side up in the Azure, so using your local clients to redirect. I'm stealing my next slide's thunder, but there we go. But we have in place already the support for multiple different operating systems. I've not mentioned it so far, but you can push out older legacy OSs such as Windows 7. Now, I'll probably touch on this later, but that Windows 7 side, you can deliver legacy applications. So if you still have an application that you absolutely cannot get off Windows 7 for some reason, now I'd suggest there are ways to be able to move off Windows 7 if you try hard enough. But if you can't, you can move a Windows 7 VM into Azure as part of WVD and publish out a full desktop to be able to give that application back down to the users without having to run physical Windows 7 machines all over the place. You can get Windows 10, get the application still. We still have a lot of the integration with Azure Active Directory and stuff that's there, the usage of Config Manager to be able to manage these devices, profile redirection with the FXlogix stuff. But one thing that we have seen at the minute is that a lot of the control plane for this is done through PowerShell. Now, there is coming a lot better integration through in the Azure portal to give you that web interface to be able to actually deploy out which apps, control who can access the application groups, spin up more capacity in it, re-register new VMs and so on. And that's currently in private preview, which if I'm just going to drop a little bit of a surprise at this point, especially for my team, if I come out of that, that starts to look like this within the Azure portal. So we have this interface coming in where we can actually control things like the application groups that you've just seen on that slide. You can choose who it is that you're going to actually be able to publish them out to, and you can actually start to control a lot better through a web interface if you're not fully comfortable with the PowerShell commands. However, it is all there and controllable. Mentioned before, Microsoft Teams, it's obviously a big focus for Microsoft for being their main premier collaboration platform now. So getting that working the best that it possibly can within Teams, within WVD is something that they're absolutely focused on. Like I say, the biggest thing is making sure they can offload as much as possible in terms of the audio and the video redirection to your physical client. So use the power that's there and send it directly to the other parties. So using that whole peering idea rather than going up and around and about the houses and having all the processing done in your VMs running in the cloud. Now, taking some of them bits, and as you start to think about how you move from just having it as either a quick, dirty spun up environment and how to move it into a very rich, optimized production environment, there's things that you can start to do to make both the user experience and your administrative experience a lot better. So thinking around things like your file data. If you're not already a heavy online SharePoint, Office 365 and OneDrive user, and you have a lot of unstructured data on your file servers, then having users coming back to and from your on-premises connection to Azure, depending on your speed of your network links, might not be the most optimized. So looking at how we can do things like Azure File Sync, being able to set up replicas with DFS namespaces and stuff in Azure to make sure that they're using the closest copies of them data without having to completely change where and how you store your data, so still making it seamless, is something that we often talk around looking at how we can optimize it. Bandwidth optimization is something that is absolutely key for here. If you are heavy users of web filtering and proxy servers and so on, and everything must go through that corporate endpoint, have another rethink of how you consider Microsoft traffic. If you're finding that a lot of users spending their time sending emails, talking and collaboration, there's no point bringing all that traffic back to on-premise to go back out through your web filtering. You implicitly trust that anyway by the very nature that you're paying for that service. So look at splitting that traffic off and having the idea of split tunneling and using it and bypassing the proxies and going direct to Microsoft from Azure. There's also free bandwidth going out of Azure to Microsoft side. Policy settings, so starting to look at how you can remove the clutter and lock it down further. So like anything, you will have a certain level of control lockdowns that you already applied to your Windows 10 devices. So taking that same concept across into your WVD, but then optimizing it further, turning off non-used services in a virtual environment, getting rid of things like MapSync, Xbox services and stuff that run natively because it's Windows 10, get them turned off. And then I mentioned around the Teams VoIP redirection when that becomes more embedded within the solution. So making sure that you reduce your administrative overhead. So looking at how you currently deploy stuff to your physical devices. Hopefully it's things like Microsoft Endpoint Manager or Configuration Manager, SCCM, that people already know, use, and natively supports WVD. Being able to re-leverage them to deliver your applications, push down your config and your changes. And then the other thing is then starting to make it very cost effective. So looking at the scalability side, leveraging automation to be able to turn these devices off when they're not used. If you're a UK-based company working 9 to 5, why are you running servers at midnight when nobody's logged on? Unless you're me and you're sad and you spend all your life working, then you go in and you play at daft times of night. But for the vast majority of your staff and your organization, you'll want to scale it right back, have them turned off, spin them up just before people come in the morning so they get a good log-on experience. And there are native integrations with Logic Apps and stuff from Microsoft to be able to orchestrate and automate that scenario for you with WVD. So I'm going to let you talk for a minute, Phil, because I need a sip of coffee.
No, that's good. I was just thinking actually that we're taking a little longer, but I think it's good content. So hopefully that sparked, and I can already see a number of questions have kind of come in over the chat that we've been having. So as we said at the start, we'll just use this now as very much an open. We've actually got a good bunch of questions that we can go through, but do please feel free to throw in your questions. All of this is being recorded as well, so just so you know, you don't need to furiously be scribbling things down, and we will share these pieces of information with you following the session as well, just to make sure you've got hold of that. But just coming back then to one of the questions. So what connections do you have in place between Azure and on-prem servers? Now this actually also links in probably with another person's question with relevant to the link to back to on-site servers, say file, SQL, would we need express route? So two questions there. The first being linked back to that when you were showing the Orchestrator app. What kind of connection are we running on for that Orchestrator app being presented? And then generally, what would be the thought process around express route necessity when starting to work with WVD? So would you like me to jump in and answer that, Steve?
It helps when I'm not answering it when I'm on mute, doesn't it? So to be totally transparent, in my demo environment, I am not accessing it from a on-premise server. So it is running on a totally separate server in a separate VLAN group and all the rest of it, which is fine for demo purposes. In a normal real-world scenario, you have the two choices. If you need to access on-premise resources, you either use a site-to-site VPN, so you can set that up with just pure Microsoft technologies, that's not a problem, or you can use ExpressRoute, and it is an or conversation. It comes down purely to what your internet pipe in terms of bandwidth, latency, and capacity has available. If you've got a completely saturated internet bandwidth pipe and latency spiking up through the wall and all the rest of it, and you are heavily investing in this solution and you still have to access stuff on premise and your testing shows that it is not a good fit in terms of your current internet pipe, then you might consider either getting a bigger internet pipe from your provider or going and getting ExpressRoute, because that is a dedicated pipe that you can just channel this traffic and content down. But it's not a case of you need ExpressRoute. That is just an option to give you the capacity that you may or may not need. A site-to-site VPN is absolutely usable, doable, and there's different SKUs and sizes that can give you the performance rating and stuff that you may need, but it comes down to what you have in terms of your bandwidth and your latency and how well your applications can react to either high latency or low latency, depending on what you have available. But the VPN side of it is just a connection method, and it's either use a VPN or you're going to a capacity conversation where you're then either increasing your internet pipe or looking at a dedicated pipe in essence just for Azure, if that makes sense. And anything else that you can add on that, Phil?
No, I think it's a fair comment, right? I think generally speaking, you do not need essentially ExpressRoute to be able to use WWbd. It does depend then on obviously the services that you're putting over, also the amount of services that you'd be communicating between sites. There's a number of pieces where you can start to do things around syncing file servers up into Azure as well to improve, kind of traffic and other bits and pieces there. But it is very much an or conversation relevant to that. It doesn't have to be a necessity, I would certainly say. So also we had another one where you mentioned FXlogix file storage. Are you using Azure files or NetApp files?
We are using Azure files. So recommendations always come down to the actual usage profiles and all the rest of it. Personally, I would recommend starting with Azure files, and as long as that suits your needs and all the rest of it, absolutely fine. The NetApp files is more a case of if you already have NetApp filers or there is a specific feature set in terms of redundancy or snapshots or stuff, then fine, you can explore them. But if it's just for general storage profiles, Azure files works a treat.
Right, thank you. So then we have another one actually more linked into RDS, but essentially customers or one of the attendees is looking to upgrade our RDS environment onto RDS 2019. How do you find 365 apps performance on RDS with the new FXlogix profiles? Is there a commentary you'd have to that, or?
Not personally from my side. So I haven't had the lovely pleasure of going and doing a production RDS 2019 environment with the FXlogix yet. But that's something that we can certainly pass back into the internal team and see whether we can link back in later.
Yeah, so we'll capture that question and we'll add that to essentially an additional feedback. So we'll get you an answer to that question as well, but we'll capture that as a point of note just to feedback following this session for those that asked it, and also everyone else, to be honest, because we'll share it with all. Now, this is always a bit of an interesting one. So one of the attendees has asked around any guidance on VM sizing when dealing with Office 365 and Teams, etc. And especially interesting, actually, with just some of the recent potential bits and pieces, but I won't steal your thunder, elements of answers.
So sizing is always the most difficult question going. So there is obviously a general set of guidance in terms of make sure per cause and so on, and that generally comes down across like different profiles of whether they are just a generalistic, like an information worker that just spends the time in Office and Word with a bit of Teams activity versus somebody that's using CAD, etc. The Teams part of the conversation obviously brings in a little bit more grunt needed than just your regular scope for business, older applications, just mainly because of the memory profile that the Electron app tends to use. So there's a couple of extra points on the Microsoft Teams site for this. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but they give some guidance for like every 4 or 5 users is a gig of RAM and so on. So we usually take them into consideration when doing the sizing. Microsoft have some good sizing calculators that we use as a base and then add on some of the Teams pieces on top of. At the minute, obviously the video usage has to be taken into account of as an overhead, and officially GA wise it is an overhead, and then obviously that will start to drop off as we get more of the audio video redirection coming in.
Yeah, I think I would just add, I'd appreciate that's a lot of variables, right, to kind of consider with it, and unfortunately with the sizing aspects, it kind of is a lot of variables to have to consider. So there are a number of tools and other bits and pieces that Microsoft make available, and we have if support would be beneficial, but essentially some of the things to consider as well is also the ways that you would approach maybe your configuration and setup. So it does have also a bearing on elements around the third-party usage of additional agents and other bits and pieces that may run on the device, and making sure as well that the profile and configuration is cleaned up to ensure optimum service running, because it can have a reasonably good effect on it. So I mean by that third-party AVs and different kind of elements to consider there. So although it can be something that then people don't want to necessarily consolidate down to a full Microsoft stuff, it can absolutely have a fairly tangible and measurable impact in terms of your specking of your performance for it. And also the one thing we'd say at the moment though is Microsoft from a wwbd side over the last few months as it's been out, or since it's went kind of GA, has had a development roadmap around Teams and expanding the performance elements around Teams as well. So, typically speaking as well, and this is an incredibly rough rule of thumb as well, it's some of the recommendations that were made, you almost were getting towards the point of doubling those when you were talking about screen Teams for video and other elements there, whilst waiting for the optimizations to come through. But although it's not anything official of the bits and pieces we have seen in literally the last 4 hours or 24 hours, some elements of stuff starting to, but there's no official side. But Microsoft are furiously in the process of releasing improvements to the Teams essentially kind of presentation of video and capabilities over WWBD as well, which should then see that bring back into the recommendations or the sizing baselines that you do see, and they are reasonable in terms of that. So I appreciate it's not a direct specific answer, but certainly some points to consider there. So hopefully that's useful with respect to it. So the next question that we had was, if a service provider is already hosting an app on WWBD, can this coexist with an environment we might spin up? So application groups and pools.
So that is a good question. So I've not personally come across it yet, because obviously having multiple people having different environments is not a common thing. However, if I just go back to here, it's no longer using it, is it? I was just wondering whether there was a tailored identity ID within the URL, in which case yes. So it doesn't. So my gut feeling would be no, they would not live alongside each other, because when you go to sign in, it wouldn't know which environment to hit. Now, if your service provider is using a different set of identities, So you're not single signing into the environment where they're hosting it. You may have more of a look. If you're single signing into that environment, I'd pretty much say will not allow you to coexist.
It'd be potentially interesting, wouldn't it, though, in terms of if it was assigned out to essentially a partner, so it's two different entities but assigned to one user. So you'd theoretically see all the presented apps to you, even though they're from two organizations, right?
No, so that bit definitely doesn't work at the minute. No, so if it's using a different identity, so we use something similar within, we'll migrate to it in a minute with our Power on Pulse platform. You have a poweronpulse.com user account versus what you're currently logged onto the machine. So I cannot merge the display of them two into one client in any way, shape, or form.
No, not necessarily suggesting that it's the one user account, but two entities providing provisioning services to it.
So if it's doing that, then the host pool and the control would have to live within your environment.
Yeah.
So the third party could potentially have the VM, that's the session host that is linked into that environment. So they control the actual VM and the application that's on it, but it would have to be your WWbd host pool in your environment, which if they've already spun it up and they're running it and they're managing it, that's their environment. So it wouldn't again merge into the same one.
Okay. So I think realistically at this point in time, it's not likely a supported scenario
No,
currently. But
so there have been discussions around Microsoft and the plans for what we call B2B, so business to business, and being able to do that seamless merging and so on. They know of the need. There is no timescales for it.
Okay. So next question was around how you're kind of controlling. How would customers control the kind of gold image or the build of the installed applications and future patching of OS and applications? Actually, kind of linked in to some degrees with other questions we had, where whether things like Intune can manage WWbd and how that might work from a management pane. So what kind of app user management is out there? I know you've touched on that a bit within the session, but do you want to just cover some of those?
Yeah, so it's like anything, there's different layers to this conversation as well, and how deep you want to go and the effort that you put behind it. So so starting at square root of one and having nothing in place and just spinning it up and starting it, you're not going to really build or maintain that gold image. You're just going to be manually installing some applications and looking at what it looks like. That is not sustainable, obviously, so you need to move on from that. Being able to utilize something like Config Manager is an ideal way. If you are not completely destroying and trashing down your VMs, so if from a scale perspective, you're just deciding to turn off capacity and then turn back on capacity, then having something like Config Manager in there to be able to deploy and push down new applications, update applications, and keep it in a baseline scenario works really well, because VMs come on, Config Manager does its job, and it pushes it down. The updating of them can absolutely, again, be from an OS patching side, be controlled via things like Config Manager again. So you get that control layer where you can stage in which ones you want to do when. So you can leverage that side as well. And then you can start to, but it's not 100% supported and considered yet, look at Intune and some other cloud mechanisms for maintaining that environment. So Intune has a support statement in a minute where they say it's supported with limitations. So it can absolutely say, fine, I can see a VM, so I can deploy down a device-based application to it. It's obviously a little bit less flexible than the likes of Config Manager and stuff in terms of its complete discovery, control, and baselining and supersedence of applications. But if you don't have Config Manager, you can at least use that to get some applications pushed down to it, or say, fine, remove this version and put a new version on. Again, if you are keeping the same OS running. the same VM running. It doesn't necessarily like it when you start to destroy VMs, spin up new ones with the same name, because it starts to get very confused of, hang on a second, that's the same, but it's not the same anymore. And you might run into some duplicates within the portal, trying to make sure it's assigned to the right groups and stuff. And there can be a bit of fun at that stage. You can look at things like Azure Patch Management, Azure Update Management to do the patching of them VMs. That can be an option, but it's basically just giving you a layer control over the WSUS side of when you want it to run and do the scans, not as quite as flexible of being able to do some of the stuff that Config Manager side can, but it's there, it's available. And then you can move to the nth degree of control, where we start talking about being able to build our base template image so that we can completely destroy and recreate VMs on the at scale. That's really good if you want to be able to do true scale capacity, because you want to get that base image as up to date with all the applications on as possible. So when you spin up new ones, they're there and ready to use. And there are lots of different options again for that. I'm not going to go too much into them at the minute, but things like Azure Image Builder, Winwich with Config Manager and stuff, being able to build and push new templates up from your current solutions, they are all there, but they require a bit of custom automation to get that going. It's not natively part of the platform.
Great, thanks for that. I think one of the next ones would be a potentially interesting one, just depending on tie-ins. So we have 3 Fat Client line of business apps on-prem, and I'd like to move to Azure. Would this be the best way to publish them to users, mostly the finance team? We have corporate laptops and conditional access already set up on AAD with Office 365 E3, EMS E5 licensing.
Nice. Yes, it's the simplest answer to that. So while Microsoft have got some really cool technologies such as Azure AD App Proxy and stuff, which is great for getting access to internal applications without opening up stuff left, right, center, they have always been very much centered around web-based applications. As soon as you turn around to fat-based applications, what we call fat client line of business applications, like you saw me with Orchestrator and stuff, yes, because you take the exact same way that you install it on their corporate laptops and stuff, and you go and then publish that out via the desktop. Now, you could say, well, fine, if they already have corporate laptops and they already have VPNs and stuff, you could just install it and then they would connect via the VPN back to your infrastructure. Biggest problem there is you are reliant heavily on the performance of the user's broadband connections. I know full well I cannot send Phil home with a broadband with a laptop and have him connect via Orchestrator back to the main data center and stuff over VPN, because his broadband is terrible. However, I can send him home and say connect to the WWBD infrastructure and connect to that same application, because it's using a very well-known link between Azure and wherever we point it to. So we have control between data centers and Azure that we do not have control between random person on random internet connection in random location, if that makes sense. So if you can do it via a VPN connection from a laptop, you can absolutely do it via WWBD from Azure, but with a lot better control over the connection between the two endpoints.
Sounds good. So yeah, it's certainly, obviously, like you say, presents a pretty good option. The only thing I just mentioned in addition from a licensing, just because you specifically said 365 E3 and EMS, there would just need to be that kind of consideration around your Windows client OS licensing coverage as well for the access to the WWBD service, or alternative means to cover the WWBD access for the application.
Does EMS E5 not come with Windows 10 still?
No, you're thinking M365.
Oh, okay.
EMS is Intune and AIP and things like that.
Right.
So one question, just a user kind of experience piece. So computer users in our organization usually use more than one screen for the desktop. Can you open up multiple instances of web virtual desktop on different screens? Does this impact performance or licensing?
So I didn't show that earlier, did I? So when you're in the web browser, no, you cannot open up multiple instances, because when you do, it will start to take the control from one on the other. You could. I'm on a single device, unfortunately, so I can't really demonstrate this, single monitor device. You could stretch your browser across both of the screens. Not exactly ideal, but you could then have one big browser stretched across and move applications between it. However, seems that the browser is usually used where you encounter things like iPads and stuff which only have a single screen. I wouldn't necessarily say that you need to do that, because you would generally start to navigate towards having this richer remote desktop client. When you're on the remote desktop client, then it absolutely, if I can click the right button, it absolutely has, but not on mine because I'm using a single monitor, but it has the ability to actually determine, I think it's on the application layer actually, isn't it? There we go. Multiple monitors. So it is completely aware of multiple monitors when you connect to remote desktop. So either as a full desktop, so it would stretch that full desktop across both your monitors, 3 monitors, 4 monitors, whatever you've got, and your applications can be dragged and dropped between them if it's an individual application, not a problem. So in short, WWBD will use multiple monitors. I would just recommend using the full-blown remote desktop client on a PC to get the best experience out of it.
Yeah, and just a note as well, actually, one of the nice touches is it'll just auto-detect as well a lot of the current settings in configuration that the users have. So we constantly work on dual monitors, moving between kind of just universal desk setups, and it'll just automatically detect when you plug in and present that through as well. So it is a good experience, from that side of things, from a user perspective as well. Just being conscious of time, so we do have a number more questions as well. So what we will look to do is obviously share information out following this. But we had one around how does Windows 7 extended support work in WWBD? So I suppose I might start to answer this one initially. So those I'm sure will probably be aware that Microsoft, when they originally announced, they give the extended support. If you were acquiring the WWBD service and running services in there, then that would give you the extended maintenance support up until January 2023. You can run up full Windows 7. You cannot do Windows 7 multi-session, so it must be essentially the personal session VMs, and you cannot create Windows 7 based app pools, as it were. So in that context, if you were the usual thing we see this question around is when customers are looking for alternative mechanisms to handle Windows 7 applications that are causing challenges in healthcare and in other industries. So the way that you would be realistically looking to do that, and it is absolutely an option that you can do, is you would provision those applications to the Windows 7 desktop, and then essentially you would present a full desktop experience to that user. And now that really has two considerations relevant to it: whether you just then retain them on the Windows 7 environment as a VDI with the applications embedded in it from trying to keep a level of consistent user experience, or whether you even purposefully just allow access to those application dependencies via that Windows 7 kind of VDI presentation, and you still have a Windows 10 presentation of either services or otherwise. But of course that will naturally have a impact to the user experience, because they would have to open the full VDI session to access the Windows 7 applications. But yeah, you do get extended support, and that runs, default standards to the January 2023. Whether there's any kind of considerations relevant to other bits as they have extended support timelines, possibly, but realistically, we're talking 2023, so I doubt they would take any considerations to any elements there, to be brutally honest. But yeah, hopefully that kind of gives a view. I don't know whether, Steve, you have any other commentary from a more technically biased?
Not necessarily on that one. You covered that one pretty well. I was just looking through the questions and looking at some of the other ones.
Cool, sounds good. So we do have the. Do you want to go?
Yeah, do you want me to take that one about the capacity sizing, the profile sizing?
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a question that came through around about the FXlogix and the containers that it uses for doing the user profile roaming, for want of a better word. So this is a good thing. I briefly touched on it earlier just to give an explanation to some of the others when I keep on mentioning this thing called FXlogix. So if you've used in the past that really wonderful, trying not to sound too sarcastic, no, in actual fact I can't not say it, that really bad technology that was roaming profiles from Microsoft, which took the user's settings and datas from one device to another and stored it up on a file server, that was really not a good idea to use. We do need the concept of it, which is where we start to bring in this idea around the FXlogix. So this is an acquisition Microsoft made to be able to really intelligently, in a very low level, capture settings rights and stuff for certain applications and so on, and store it in a centralized container, so basically HDX. So it means that if we have users logging on to multiple session hosts, or they log off and they log on and get redirected somewhere else, it follows them. It follows all of their settings around with them. Now, like anything, there's always going to be limits to sizes and capacity that you can provision for these. And basically the question that came through was, have we run into issues with the FXlogix file containers reaching their maximum size, which is about 30 gig in size from memory? Understand there's ways to cap it, and once it reaches max or cap size, are there any utilities to prune or maintain it? So we've not personally run into any issues with it hitting that max size. Like I say, it's 30 gig. And if it's set up and controlled in the first instance, and you put a lot of the redirection and the filtering XMLs in place to cut out as much as possible in terms of the junk that can still go that way. So something that the roaming profiles was always guilty of just taking everything. While FXlogix on the default does a lot better job, you can still prune and trim it further. So putting some of them in place helps. Obviously, it's never going to be ideal. There are some automation capabilities that you can do with scripting and stuff to maintain and trim it down. So little things like if you are going to still take across, which is absolutely needed, things like their users' cookies and so on, from the web browser sessions, you want them to go across because you want them to have that good experience, but making sure that you trim that down. Clean up after applications. So if you are using things like GoToMeeting and stuff in it, make sure they're trimmed down. You want to have something in place for that. There are a couple of other third parties that do some like reporting capabilities to show you what type of junk you have within your profiles or where it's holding the most data that are worth using. Probably the easiest way for me to say this, to give you a really good guide to go in, is Aaron Parker that runs stealthpuppy.com. Well known for everything that he does with desktop applications, management profiles, RDS. I believe he has a really good post that I read some time ago around the best practices for capacity planning and maintenance with FXlogix. He does go into some of the bits in there around trimming and pruning and so on. So have a look at the stealthpuppy.com blog post on FXlogix capacity management.
All right, sounds good. I think then just being conscious of time and not wanting to take people's entire lunches, because I'm sure they will need to try and grab something as well. We will, as I say, share recordings and other bits and pieces. But Steve, do you want to just kind of close out the session, unless anyone wants to throw any last minute questions into the mix? But I think we've covered a good amount of all the bits. There might be just one or two stragglers of questions, but hopefully I think we've covered most things.
Yep. Did you want to run through these ones?
Yeah, I suppose actually, yeah, of course. So I guess realistically, just a very quick, Lynn, 2 minutes, and then we'll let you kind of get on with bits and pieces. Essentially, you know, the things you'd kind of expect with a service prerequisites, you do need to have an Azure subscription, because although a lot of the times it can be presented as free under the Microsoft licensing, you still need to have the infrastructure paid for. So there will be infrastructure costs, and there will be that Azure subscription necessity, due to the fact that we're obviously delivering user-based services to our users, and then essentially an Azure Active Directory and a synchronized user accounts and other bits and pieces where you're going to be provisioning to for it as well. And within that Azure subscription, it is going to consume different elements around the infrastructure, based on the capacity that you do, as well as the storage and a few other kind of considerations depending on what kind of optimizations and other parts you will look for. The main thing to consider as well from a licensing is really that you do need that kind of enterprise Windows license. It needs to have been purchased under a volume licensing agreement, and essentially that kind of commercial license agreement relevant to it. So we're talking things like M365, Windows E3, or if you don't have an underpinning piece of hardware and you're doing this to a thin client type device, then you'd be looking at something called like the BDA licensing aspects as well with that. As this is something that Microsoft has been seeing help a lot of customers, and also in context around different parts, you know, you can speak with an account team member from our side if you would like to know more, but also there is option support that Microsoft is putting forward to those customers, and they've been pretty good about it, to be honest with you. So I'm normally caveats everywhere with this type of statement, but they've been pretty good that, you know, assistance could be supported, you know, in terms of helping you get started with an initial pilot, looking at WWbd. You do need to be serious about wanting to seriously look at it. It doesn't mean that you have to adopt it, but essentially what we'll be looking at is helping you maybe get in something like a 25 user kind of production pilot that you can really then kind of put it through its paces and see whether this is something that would be a solution that may work for you. And, you know, a lot of that work will give you all that kind of foundations you need in terms of it. I think an interesting thing to consider with this as well is as Steve kind of touched on right at the start of the session, you know, this is that got a real strength of advantage in the context that it integrates with a lot of the Microsoft 365 cloud services and products. So that idea of stateless data and user ability to move around, but just the simple fact that you can turn it up, down, off, left, right, and all the rest essentially with it, it gives you as organizations and businesses a lot of flexibility around choice. So in terms of either having it just purely as a backup and a DR type of a solution is absolutely something that could be there. But we're seeing a trend within customers' mindsets where remote working by default is starting to become a conversational type style that some business leaders are pushing, but certainly at least it's that it's included by default, if you will, so that you have the option to move to it, you know, and move around between it in terms of that as well. So like I say, won't labor the point any further, but Steve, you just like to go to the next slide, please, and then essentially you can get in touch with us. So there's a number of ways, you know, if you've got an existing account teams and other bits and pieces, please feel free to reach out. As I say, no expectations from our side relevant to this. You know, we just look to help share knowledge in other parts. Or if you haven't got an existing relationship, then do just feel free to drop us a note, and we'll certainly look to help have a chat and see what might make sense. But do like to thank you for your time here. If you have any suggestions around kind of additional topics or other areas that you would like to see similar kind of Q&A sessions done on, we would welcome those kind of inputs. We like to obviously try and make sure that this information is as relevant to all as possible. So please just send those in to us, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. But yes, thank you very much, and we will share all the information from today's session with you so you can peruse at your leisure.